Hello, good morning, good afternoon to you from wherever you're joining us in the world. Welcome to the last Thursday in Privacy. This is the second instalment of the digital event series sponsored and brought to you by the Data Protection World Forum. This monthly event takes place on the last Thursday of the month and is aimed at bringing together the communities of both privacy and security from around the globe. In fact, last month's event attracted over 100 different countries all tuning in to hear what they have done today. My name is Steve Wright. I'm partner at Privacy Culture and I'm your anchor man for the day. And we've got a great day in store for you. And it's been fantastic since it started at 7 a.m. here in the UK. And we have got a really good panel coming up next, and I'm delighted to introduce the panel. They're going to be talking about cookies and consent compliance, and this is a tricky subject. How to collect, store and deploy personal data through web trackers. The panel is hosted none other by Catherine Armitage, and she is Director of Digital Policy at the World Federation of Advertisers in Brussels. At the World Federation of Advertisers, Catherine provides strategic guidance on some of the digital governance challenges facing advertisers in a data-driven, hyper-connected world. She runs the WFA's Digital Governance Exchange Forum and leads advocacy work to represent the voice of marketeers. Catherine began her career at Procter & Gamble, where she led brand marketing initiatives and e-commerce strategy across Western Europe. So without further ado, I'll leave you in the very capable hands of Catherine. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion. We are delighted to be talking about cookies and consent compliance with everyone today. It is a big and very interesting topic, so I know we will have a lot to discuss. As we're going through, please feel free to jump onto the Q&A and post your questions. There's also the chat where you can have a bit more of an in-depth discussion if there are things you want to follow up on. We'll be answering your questions as we go through. So I'm going to hand over now to Romain, who's going to introduce himself.
Thank you, Catherine. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Romain Gauthier, co-founder and CEO of Didomi. Didomi is a consent management platform. We are headquartered in France, in Paris, and we work with clients in over 20 countries right now. Our solutions are deployed across above 30,000 websites and mobile applications, and collecting consent for cookies and trackers in most countries where they have internet access. So we have clients in a number of verticals, in the telecom, in the banking and insurance, in the travel, and most digital verticals. And I'm really happy to be with you today.
Thanks, Romain. Andrew.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the session. I'm Andrew from Securys. Securys is a consultancy providing privacy support to organizations small and large. We have clients ranging from small charities to entertainment sector, particularly hard hit at the moment, through to large multinationals. And we advise on policy, governance, and practical deployment of privacy in their organizations to build trust with all the various stakeholders affected by the handling of personal data.
Thanks, Andrew. Laurie-Anne.
For Isabel Group as a privacy and risk officer. Isabel Group is a small, big fintech, but small company. So our challenges are very different from issues.
All right, thanks, Laurie-Anne. I think we're having a little bit of trouble with your sound. It keeps cutting out. But I think the Data Protection World Forum team will try and help you with that. So we'll get started, and then you just chip in whenever you feel it's a bit more stable. Cool. All right, so cookies and consent. Let's start with an easy one. Or is it easy? What do we mean when we talk about consent here in the context of cookies? So what does the law require now? Andrew, do you want to give us a quick dummy's guide to consent when it comes to cookies?
I think the key point is that there's more than one law, which is why there's a lot of confusion in the market, because the ePrivacy Directive and in the UK PECA were out there long before the new GDPR and Data Protection Act, and they allowed a different kind of consent, or at least it was fairly silent on what consent meant. Then along came GDPR and the UK Data Protection Act and equivalent acts elsewhere in Europe, and it's now clear from all the regulators that consent for placing cookies and other tracking mechanisms now means GDPR style consent. So explicit, not implied, clearly informed, so lots of transparency information, granular, whatever that may mean. Does that mean by broad purpose, or does that mean by individual advertiser? So it is a complicated question, but the clear message is explicit consent at a granular level, no nudging and all of those kind of things that come in with pre-ticked boxes and so forth that have been outlawed.
And Romain, you are a consent management platform, so I imagine consent is a central part of your day job. Can you tell us a bit about how you view consent in this context?
Sure. So for us, consent is about three things. It's about consent collection. So putting in front of the user on its front end, on its computer, on its mobile device, a message by which he will or will not accept the use of cookies or trackers. So that's like the collection point where a lot of things happen and a lot of complexity arises from different regulations, different also business issues. Then next to that, you have to store this consent event. So store it in a way that first is required by law, so to be able to prove that you had consent. And there are still questions about cookie consent. In France, for instance, the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, in its recommendations, required for an individual proof of cookie consent, which is like very surprising because if you think about it, it requires more data than just a cookie to ensure an individual proof of cookie consent. So even if the recommendations are not final, this is a point that is still leads to a lot of questions, and storage is also something that can be very useful, because it's also a way for our clients to understand consent behaviors related to cookies. So to produce analytics with respect to cookie consent, measure your consent rates, measure like user behaviors related to the collection point that you present to them. And then the last part for us is to distribute these consent events. So distribution may sound a bit weird in this context, but it's the idea that generally as a company, you're not the only one dropping cookies or reading cookies on your website, using mobile identifier on your mobile apps. You use a number of vendors, and sometimes for large media outlets, it can mean hundreds, if not thousands of vendors, which will have access to your user internet browser, to your user mobile device, and use cookies. And so how do you ensure that all these vendors understand correctly the consent event that has just happened? That's like where there is a lot of challenge, and that's where, as a consent management platform, as a CMP, we deliver most of our value by correctly integrating with these vendors, by deploying standards that allow you as a company to transfer consent signals correctly to your vendors.
Yeah, and you know, so I work at the World Federation of Advertisers, where we work with about 120 different global brands on the client side. And it's true that that challenge that you were just talking about is something which we see all the time in the advertising industry, because of course, a lot of the data that's being collected by those cookies is being then used within the digital advertising ecosystem to target and measure advertising. And yeah, there could be hundreds, even thousands of different companies somewhere in that ecosystem accessing cookie data. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. We've actually just at WFA, we've developed a kind of tool to help brands run a kind of audit of their own, at least their own websites, to be able just to understand a kind of risk level, depending on the number and the types of different entities involved in that chain, to then be able to identify what kind of action they need to take. Is that something that you've seen a lot as well, Romain?
Absolutely, and I think the key word here is a chain, because it's not only about direct relationships that you have with your vendors, so tags or web trackers that you put on your website that will be executed when your website loads. It's also about like the chain of their vendors that will be brought by them onto your website, and this chain can be very long. So it's like a tree which has like a number of ways, of paths, and how to build that tree for you as a company, how to understand which are the vendors that are likely to be dropping cookies or reading cookies on your website. That's where the complexity generally starts. And you're right, there are like ways, tools to systematically audit your websites to ensure you correctly understand on each page of your website what are the cookies likely to be dropped. And also you can understand the relationship between these cookies and your vendor. So which vendor is bringing these cookies onto your website. So rebuilding that tree. That's like for us when we started, we realized that was going to be a massive challenge, and it's very specific to the advertising industry, to the ad tech ecosystem, for various reasons. But we also see that in other for other reasons. It's less frequent, but it can happen. It can happen, for instance, that because you're using Google Analytics, sometimes Google is dropping YouTube cookies on your website. In our audits, we come up with this type of discoveries sometimes, and so what we see is that it's very dynamic. So as a company, especially if you are a large company, you may run an audit on day one and like be confident that you have like fully understood what has happened on this day. But the next day, one team in France will have deployed another marketing partner. This marketing partner will bring onto your website 10 new vendors, which will in turn bring in 10 vendors each, and suddenly you end up having not solved your actual challenge, because on day two you're already no more compliant. So I think that's where technology can help, and it's very much needed. It's absolutely not manageable by human beings. So you can take a very strict approach to this challenge, say like force your vendor not to drop any outside cookies or to call any other vendors. That's an option to ensure you have only direct relationships and you have that under control. Or there are like other ways which we may discuss. Andrew, what maybe like you, from your experience helping companies during this type of audits, what does come up very like most frequently on your side?
You're right. There's a huge complexity in terms of what cookies are going to get dropped on a website, depending on all sorts of integrations you've got. And the sort of audit tool you're talking about can certainly help inform the eventual consumer of the website as to whether they want to accept those cookies. But during the design of the website or the rollout of a new version, that audit will actually give the marketing folks some information and possibly give them some surprises about the people who are involved in their website and the level of tracking and cookie management that's going on. So I think it's a really useful tool for privacy by design, which we're all now required to do, to say on a regular basis, let's audit this, let's look at what are we doing, let's take it back to basic principles. Why are we dropping these? Are they proportionate to our purpose? Have we got appropriate transparency around it? And having that audit will demonstrate privacy by design, because you're leaving a trail that says, we've looked at this again, we've decided that yes, it's still proportionate, yes, it's still a good idea, yes, the retention is right, yes, we're getting clear, explicit consent. So it can help bake privacy by design into every refresh of the website to have that kind of an audit tool in place, yes.
Yeah, really, really important work to be doing. We'd love to hear from you if you're on the call and you've done an audit like that, or you've been facing similar challenges. Do shout. We'd love to hear your experiences and share those. Now, Romain mentioned the CNIL a minute ago. Obviously, that is the French Data Protection Authority. And as you were saying, that there are specific things that they have said, although it's not entirely clear. This is one of the big challenges when it comes to cookie consent, because we don't just have the CNIL to look at, we actually have data protection authorities in all of the different member states, and many of them have released their own guidelines. Andrew, what kind of challenges has that been posing to the clients and the experience that you've been working with?
The first challenge is understanding the different guidance that each regulator is coming out with, because at the moment we don't have a single new ePrivacy directive. All of the regulators are looking through their own lens and going, what does that mean for our data subjects? What do we think we should be doing? And are coming out with some fairly differing approaches. Take analytics as an example. The ICO says analytics is never essential. It's always going to require consent. Whereas other regulators are taking the view that first-party analytics is sufficiently non-intrusive, and the CNIL has got some guidance around what constitutes non-intrusive first-party analytics. And if you comply with that, then their view is you don't need explicit consent. However, you better not keep those cookies for any more than 13 months, because that's a reasonable period of time over which to do trend analysis. You can't set them to expire forever. And different regulators are taking different views on that. So if you're planning a Europe-wide website, or you're planning a localizable website, at this point, you need to think either, am I going to comply with each country separately in terms of their guidance, or am I going to find the strictest applicable set of rules and apply them universally across the entire space? Which is quite a challenging decision to take, both in terms of marketing and in terms of what the end customer is going to expect to see as they get educated by their regulators in what to look for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hoping that some of this disparity goes away when the eventual ePrivacy update comes through and makes that universal across Europe. But even so, what's the UK going to do? Yeah, let's not have that discussion in too much detail. But we're also, lots of people are marketing outside the EU, outside the EEA. What do they need to do then in the States? California is now behaving differently from the rest of the US. Other bits of the US are thinking, oh, the Californians have got this right, maybe we should follow. So the same issue is going to exist outside Europe. This isn't a European problem. Europeans have just had it first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the ePrivacy regulation is a whole other box that I think we're going to have to open in this discussion. But that definitely adds even more complexity on top. Laurie-Anne, can you tell us a little bit about the ePrivacy regulation and how that's impacting you as a small business?
So the future regulation would actually simplify things for us because like with the GDPR, it will uniformize the rules that are applicable to all countries. Today, it is indeed difficult to manage the requirements of each countries and of the business and of our shareholders. And with the one set of rules, at least we would know where we are going. Also, very interesting for us is these exceptions for analytical cookies that could be integrated, that are in line with the CNIL law, actually. That would also make it more clear for our business and for our marketing department what they need to do to keep their beloved statistics.
Thanks, Laurie-Anne. Romain, what is your perspective on the ePrivacy regulation? Are you following that really closely at the moment? Are you engaging in the legislative process, or are you just kind of waiting to see what happens?
We obviously we are following that very, very closely. and we've been for a while now, and with a number of like a surprise, and it comes back, and no, it has changed, and it's something that for me is not going to happen anytime soon. And so right now our focus is more around how do like local DPAs coordinate their like interpretation of the ePrivacy directive that is still valid and GDPR, and we see some convergence across a number of countries. The European Data Protection Board has expressed some views there, specifically targeted to the question of cookie consent. So we think there is a form of consensus that is already emerging around cookie consent in leading European countries, with the exception of Spain. Interestingly, where like the Spanish DPA has very strong views and also like defends its views quite with interesting arguments with respect to what constitutes a valid consent, and their scrolling is still acceptable, and a lot of very large Spanish websites collect consent through scroll, and I find that interesting that. There is still some debate, but overall, and if you look back 2 years ago, there has been a lot of progress towards this convergence that cookie consent should be defined in a way that is harmonized across Europe. I think like Germany is also moving in that direction with new decisions that have just recently come up, and so I see like a form of consensus emerging, and so as a European company, it's going to be easier to interpret what you're supposed to do, and at least much easier than it was like even 6 months ago. So there is good news, and of course, I'm like Laurie-Anne said, we would be all better off if the ePrivacy regulation was there and also interpreted correctly across all European countries. There is still a long way to go, and so in the meantime, our role as a service provider providing consent management services is to ensure our clients find in the solutions we deliver a way to comply with their local realities, and like, try to make that as simple as possible.
It is a really fragmented picture at the moment, and we can only hope that in the future there'll be a bit more harmonization. That's definitely something that at WFA we've been pushing for in our conversations with policymakers in Brussels, where I'm based. Even though we have this fragmentation and this uncertainty with the ePrivacy regulation coming, I'd like us to talk a little bit about what can you do if you're a company right now in terms of managing the current situation, and what does good consent management look like today, bearing in mind that, who knows, this could change in the future if we get a new set of guidelines from one DPA, or we get the ePrivacy regulation miraculously comes into force. But let's have just a discussion about what good consent management looks like. Andrew, what does good consent management look like to you?
I would take it back to the basic principles. This isn't so much about compliance, it's about doing it right and building trust with the relevant stakeholder, in this case, typically a consumer on a website. So let's go back to, if this requires consent, what does the GDPR say consent has to look like? It has to be freely given, so we've got to ask very clearly for it and not put it in the way of other things or bundle it up with things. It has to be specific, therefore. It's got to be informed, so we have an education job to do in getting consent, to explain to people why we want to do what we're doing and why we think that's reasonable. It's reasonable to ask for their consent to do it. And then it's got to be unambiguous, and it's got to be as easy to take away as to give. And I think that's where the previous implied consent model falls down. It's terribly easy to keep scrolling or hit that OK button when that is the only button. It is less easy to click through 3 layers of screens to get to the bit that says, if you really want to fix this, go and read all about cookies and find out how. it is not as easy to withdraw consent as it is to give it in that scenario. So I think what good looks like is putting the customer in control, telling them what we're doing, explaining why, letting them make a choice, and letting them change their mind.
And actually, just to
consent process.
Yeah, just to build on that, Andrew, there's a
technology to do this properly.
Sorry, Andrew, you cut out a little bit there. I think I might have cut off the end of your discussion, but actually, I do just want to build on that point you were just making, because there's a great comment in the Q&A from Steph, who says that the output at the moment of all of this is basically over complex cookie notifications. The cookie notice does two things. First of all, it tries to inform, and then second of all, it tries to facilitate an action. And in Steph's opinion, the majority of cookie banners seem to be relying upon a kind of cookie fatigue of the data subject, just to get them to kind of give up and just say, yeah, fine, I accept, get rid of that annoying window and carry on with my browsing. Laurie-Anne, do you agree with this? And if so, who do you think is responsible? And is their accountability really being shown in this situation?
I see the point, and indeed, I've seen it a lot. I've seen indeed cookie banners that are overly complex, with all the providers listed and not and ticked in by default, that you have to tick out if you want to. I've seen this, and indeed, this is really playing on consent fatigue. That's clearly a dark pattern in usability, but also in compliance. In my opinion, even legally, if we see the latest judgment in Belgium, because it is ticked out, it is illegal. But even without that, if it's too complex to just navigate to somewhere where you can say, I declined everything, yes, you are playing the consent fatigue aspect. The best practice would be to have indeed the accept all, deny all, configure. What I see more today is accept all and configure, which is obviously pushed by business and marketing teams, because they today have no other options. They need consent, they need it for statistics, for behavioral analytics. And there again, I'm expecting for the ePrivacy regulation with the possibility for borders to store the preferences of people and to give the consent in the instead of the person, to lower this reliance on consent fatigue.
That really chimes with something that Joanne Woolley has written in the box. She asked a really interesting question, which builds on what you just said, Laurie-Anne. She says, do you think that cookie consent has lost its power and the whole intent around transparency has been lost? Romain, what do you make of that?
In some ways, yes, but I think there has been a lot of progress around making cookie consent effective, and that's something we forget. It's if I say no, it works, and cookies will not be dropped, cookies will not be read, and this didn't exist 2 years ago, and most cookie banners back then were kind of deceptive, because it led you to believe that if you did some things, cookies would not be used, and that didn't work. So I think the main progress that we made from a technology standpoint is ensuring that cookie consent can be effective. Now that it works, a lot of people realize that, okay, if it works well, and if people say no, then I don't have any more analytics, I can't run remarketing, and this becomes a business issue, and that's where some have tried to configure the UX and UIs in a way that maximizes their consent rate, and they can't be blamed for that, because obviously people have to earn their living, and businesses don't need some personal data for some of them. I think it's not true for all of them, but that's another topic. So I think that's the main benefit that comes, and I find it very interesting to see opinions evolve around these questions. Should I ask should I offer the option to refuse right on the first layer? How should I layer my information? up to what granular extent should I display this information? Should I bring in like opt-out mechanisms on the vendor level, etc.? My opinion is that you should do like all of these things, but in a way that is easy to use for users. So not all users are interested in that. Some are. So some would like to see that they can specifically opt out for Google on your website. If you can make it happen, why wouldn't you like offer this option? Now, it's not an option that is as important as like denying all cookie consents on all cookie dropping on the first layer, but it's still something that could be relevant for some businesses. So I think that's where like everybody is learning, and for me, like putting that in a browser is not a good idea, because everybody will be subjected to whatever the browsers decide, and your businesses will not be able to reflect their specific way of interacting with their user, which may require more personal data than another business in another vertical. So I think my personal opinion is that you should like display the very transparent choices. You should allow people to have full control, to say no when they want, to make it very easy, and especially to make it very easy for them to change their mind. The second thing that I think is missing today is that not all cookies need to be dropped on the first page, and that's where there is tremendous progress to be made. Maybe you need your analytics cookies, but you don't need retargeting cookies right on the homepage. And the tendency is to collect consent for every cookies at first when the user sees even before the user lands on your website. That's not something that I find very intuitive. And as a user, I find it kind of bothering. So that's where from a technology standpoint, I'd like things to make progress. But otherwise, what I take back out of all the things that have been deployed and across a number of websites in the last 2 years is consent is now effective. That's a massive plus for end users and for companies. It brings a lot more security to the whole system.
Yeah, and I think from a brand perspective, when I think about the members of WFA, what we hear a lot is that brands want to be able to maintain the ability to communicate directly with the consumer about their privacy and the data that's being collected from them. So your point earlier about moving that to the browser, it takes something away from that. And I think brands, the best consent sort of management tools that I've seen have somehow tried to bring in that element of the brand experience and the value exchange that you get from, if you give this data to the brand, then they can do this with it and it's better experience for you. Those are kind of some of the best examples that I've seen, and that's quite hard to do as a sort of generic browser level experience.
I think from a brand standpoint, it's the first thing that the user will see on your website, and so for me, you should really like think carefully about how to display the message. How does it fit in the overall UX? And it's not like a same size fits all. For cookie consent is not that type of problem, and it has been solved that way so far. But I think by lack of solutions mainly. But to me, it's where there is still massive progress to be made. Now that we can make it effective, we can bring a lot more like UX and UI learnings into this consent workflow. We can measure things better now that, for instance, the CNIL allows us to measure things, and so everything is like starting to look clear, and that's I'm expecting a lot of creativity around this cookie consent in the next month, mainly because brands will have to ask for real consent and give the ability for users to say no. That's non-existent today, and the day it's required, that's where things will start to be very interesting and creative, and move privacy more into the customer relationship rather than just compliance.
Yeah, there's a really good comment in the Q&A box actually from Lee. Comment on this. He says that often brands aren't seeing data subjects the same way as they see their customers or prospects, which is mad when you think about it. The privacy experience is not customer centered. From the proposition to the UX to the comms, brands need to see the opportunity that great privacy experiences enable. gaining, nurturing, defending, and extending consent is crucial.
I think Romain's point on retargeting is a really interesting one to look at from that perspective. At the moment you first land on a website, you're not in the mood to be retargeted. You haven't decided whether you're going to put anything in your shopping basket and then go away and think about it. So if you really had to give granular specific consent to retargeting, you're going to say no on your first visit to a website. But if you've got right through to the basket, and then you've thought, actually, I just need to go away and measure that space in my garden where this bench is going to go, or check whether Auntie Maud is free to come to the opera with me that night, or whatever it is you're buying, then you might find it helpful to have a reminder, and you might actively opt in to say, if I don't come back within 24 hours, would you mind reminding me about this? That would actually be very good customer service. It would be very good privacy practice. It would be extremely granular and explicit consent. And my suspicion is, from a smaller pool of consented subjects, you would see a much higher conversion rate. So it would also be a better marketing spend. Who wouldn't want all of that?
What is the most valuable brand in the world? It's Apple. And since 2015, what is like Apple messaging? It's like privacy is like, if you come to Apple, you'll have privacy. That's the #1 selling point. It's the unique selling proposition against their competition. They made privacy part of like their user experience, their product, everything. And I think there is a link between them being the most valuable brand and privacy. It's not by chance. And these are very like clever people. So I think every brand should have this type of thinking, is how do privacy fits in my customer relationship. If I'm a luxury brand, it may be critical, and so I'd rather have people say no than rather move away from me. And for a media outlet, it's a very different question, because if your users don't say yes to advertising on the first page, you lose half of your revenue. So it becomes a very different, very different question. So that, I think, is what every brand should question.
Yeah, and I think what's really exciting that we're seeing from a brand's perspective with our members is that one of the really hot areas right now for many brands and advertisers is the area of data ethics. So actually thinking about privacy and the way you talk to people about their data beyond compliance. So not just thinking about like what do I have the right to do with people's data legally, but what is the right thing to do with people's data? And sort of elevating that conversation into something that fits much more into a brand or a company's purpose. In the same way as many companies have done in the past with issues like sustainability, for example. And I think it's quite exciting because it feels like this is probably the next big thing that we're going to start seeing, as more and more companies developing their own data ethics principles and their own sort of positioning around how they will and won't use people's data. And we've actually got a report coming out just next week, which kind of is a kind of guide to data ethics for advertisers, that just starts to try and explore some of these areas, because they're big areas. It's new, it's difficult for many companies, but I do feel like more and more companies are starting to take that sort of the shift towards the Apple positioning to say, actually, privacy isn't just a legal issue, it's actually a brand issue.
We're planning some research around that to understand not only what customer attitudes are to privacy, but does it actually affect their behavior? Is there a tipping point beyond which they will prefer one brand over another because the privacy experience is better?
Laurie-Anne, is that something that you've considered as a fintech, about how privacy fits from a brand perspective, not just from a regulatory perspective? I know you're in a sector that is very heavily regulated as it is.
Yes, our primary concern is regulation. We are regulated very heavily, so we have tackled GDPR compliance, ePrivacy compliance as another regulation, but we are trying to find solution because these topics, they are the way we present ourselves to our customers. It's ongoing project, and that's projects that will take long time to achieve a result we are satisfied with. But yes, definitely we are taking this into consideration, but it has the same weight as any other business requirements. maybe a bit lower than some of the business objectives. Or my job, my goal is indeed to sell privacy and respect of our customers as an added value, to sell it as, yeah, there are many other fintechs. We do the same kind of things because the law is quite prescriptive in what we can do. And if we sell that we can indeed protect data better, so the information security aspect, but also respect data subjects, so our customers, users, or directly our customers, that's something we are thinking.
It's very interesting, Laurie-Anne. I think it's, yeah, when you think about from a company's perspective, regulation, you do need to get that right as a basic, of course. And it's only once you've mastered that, then you can kind of move to that next stage as well of thinking about, okay, what is this like from a brand perspective? We've got 5 minutes left, and oh, Romain, sorry, did you want to come in?
I wanted to add, like, let's not forget that like cookies can have like a direct relationship with your business, and I think as a company, that's why what you should be looking to uncover, is there a link between my ability to drop cookies and my business outcomes? If you're an e-commerce merchant and if your acquisition depends like for 50% on retargeting, then yes, there is an obvious link between your ability to sell products and your ability to drop cookies. If you're a media company, as I said, yeah, your monetization almost entirely depends on personalized advertising, which carries like twice as much value as non-personalized advertising. And so yes, there is a link, and it's not true for a lot of businesses, but it is for some, and it changes the perspective on cookie consent and how you should implement it, how you should present the messaging to your user, etc. So that's, I think, number one thing to consider in this idea that cookie consent is linked to your brand value.
Yeah, thanks, Romain. Now we've got just 3 minutes left, and I've realised that it would be completely remiss of us to finish this conversation without having mentioned the other big thing on the horizon, which is CCPA. So can we do a very, very quick discussion about CCPA in a few minutes? Andrew, what does CCPA mean for cookies and consent?
What it mostly means is being very clear about whether you are monetizing people's data. It talks about the right not to have your data sold, and that isn't just sold for cash, it's sold for value. So if you're using an apparently free product and you're sharing the data that product collects with somebody who is another data controller, then you probably fall within CCPA. And there are analytics platforms, for example, that behave like that. So you need to think really carefully about what is the purpose of this cookie to me and what is it to any other controller, and make that transparent.
Romain?
Yeah, I would just it's all about this do not sell button, how to make it effective. And if you're a European company, you'll find that very easy and just very similar to what you've put in place for your European users. But for US companies, it's something fairly new, and this idea that you have to be able to block cookies if your user clicks on this do not sell button is kind of a new challenge, and yeah, there is then a lot of discussion around how should I approach this challenge. Should I use like tag management systems? Should I do that myself? Should I do that automatically? What's yeah, and that's just like, I think the first step towards more control for the end user, because the day you start giving control to your user, people are going to use it to ask for more control, and so I think it's kind of a virtuous circle. It leads to a world where privacy will be like at the center of any customer relationship, even in countries where compliance is less like restrictive, as in Europe.
Yeah, and just as a side note, I think it's quite funny that I asked this question at the end. We probably should have asked it at the beginning. But Laurie-Anne, when we talk about cookie provisions, are we just talking about cookies? What are we actually talking about here?
Yes, indeed. It's not only about cookies. It's the law says state cookies as an example, but it's in fact tracking mechanisms. So it's beacons, using device fingerprinting, everything that can relate a previous session to a new session. We are even seeing zombie cookies arriving now, that are cookies that you can't really delete. So yes, it's indeed. I think there was a question on this topic, tracking mechanisms, and it's not only about websites, traditional. It's also in every apps. So every game that you install on your phone or apps that you install on a computer through an app store, they have to follow the same rules, and that's often forgotten.
I think zombie cookies is probably one of the scariest things that I've ever heard. I think that will definitely stay with me as the conclusion of this conversation. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this discussion today. It's been so interesting. I think we could spend many more hours actually here discussing this, and I'm aware there's plenty more questions in the Q&A that we didn't manage to get to, but so just thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to everyone who's on the line, who's asked questions and listened to us for 45 minutes. Now I'm going to hand back over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. That was a fascinating panel, and I was making plenty of notes as we went through there. Really some great sound bites there. Really interesting. Thank you. So my name's Steve Wright. I'm your anchor man today for the last Thursday in Privacy, brought to you by the Data Protection World Forum. And the next panel is coming up in approximately 14 minutes. And it's a fireside chat, once again, with Joe Tidy, the BBC correspondent. And he's having a conversation with Havor Mallard, discussing the topic of ransomware attacks. And, you know, everything that all of us as DPAs and CISOs want to avoid. But having been in that situation myself, it's incredibly tricky. So delighted to be welcoming those guests in 10 to 12 minutes. Just leaves me to thank Catherine from the WFA and all of her guests for that interesting panel on cookies. Thank you very much. And I'm also worried about zombie cookies now. I'm looking it up quickly to find out zombie cookies, and you know, it sounds like a horror movie, doesn't it? But really great panel. Thank you so much. And yeah, great questions coming through from the audience. We look forward to welcoming you back in about 10, 12 minutes. Thanks so much. Good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.